Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that General Rochambeau, the commander of the French army, dishonestly communicated behind George Washington's back, and this may have won the war for the Americans? That men like Alexander Hamilton, Henry Knox, George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, the Baron von Steuben, and Benjamin Lincoln were all at the Battle of Yorktown fighting together? What a reunion. And following the Battle of Yorktown, both Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold sailed to England together in despair, their lives forever stained by their defeat in the colonies. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we'll cover that and more in episode 69, The Battle of Yorktown, the day the world turned upside down. Hello, and welcome into episode 69. It is just me today. I'm very excited to continue with our narrative and begin to wrap up the Revolutionary War. A quick note, Zach, Bill, and I recorded the Patreon bonus episode on the film The Patriot, and that will be up on Patreon on Friday, so check that out when it's posted. And the book recommendation for this week is In the Hurricane's Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown by Nathaniel Philbrick. This is actually a brand new book. It just came out last month. I ordered it once it came out and I read it. It was fantastic. I really love all of Nathaniel Philbrick's works. So if you like this one, check out his other ones too. Really, really great stuff. So to catch everyone up, I want to briefly provide context for our lesson today. Last week, we left off with the Continental forces turning the tide on the British in the South. Southern militias scored a massive victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain in October of 1780, crushing a loyalist militia force of over 1,000 men. Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan then decided to split up their forces in the South in order to force Cornwallis to do the same. And Morgan was able to land a shocking and dominant victory at the Battle of Cowpens over Bannister Tarleton in January of 1781, killing or capturing almost all of Tarleton's forces in the process, crushing any real chance Cornwallis had at putting a foothold in South Carolina and moving into North Carolina. While this was happening, Greene had fully embraced Fabian tactics, refusing to fight Cornwallis in open battle, and instead continued to string him along in the South, forcing him to chase Greene and stretch his supply lines even further. Greene kept losing small engagements after small engagement, but he knew the time and resources were on his side. He was truly losing the battle, but winning the war. While Greene was avoiding pitched battle, the British troops were growing weary, both physically and psychologically. They were growing tired of war and tired of marching all over God's green earth looking for an army that wasn't particularly interested in fighting them in the first place. While Greene was playing a game of cat and mouse with Cornwallis, men like Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens were attacking British supply lines, preventing them from raising militia or holding land and making life just as difficult as possible for them in the process. And that brings us to our topic today, the Battle of Yorktown, the end of the Revolutionary War for all intents and purposes. Because while all of this was happening in the South, what Cornwallis really wanted to do was abandon this whole southern plan and move north. He was beginning to recognize that this southern strategy just was not working like they thought it would, and he was tired of fighting a fight that he didn't actually think he was set up to win. Knowing that supplies were pouring into the Americas from the mid-Atlantic, Cornwallis had been asking Clinton to take a position in the area, preferably in the Chesapeake. But Clinton had refused, convinced that Washington and the French would eventually attack New York, and he needed to be there ready for it. Because of this, and because of his rising anger, Cornwallis's rising anger about this situation, he decided he was going to take it upon himself to camp at Yorktown. And that is what we'll get into today. After failures at Newport and Savannah, the French and the Americans recognized that if this alliance was going to work, they were going to need to work together, like really work together. And that meant that the French would have to get serious about their commitment to the cause. And in the winter of 1780 and 1781, that's exactly what the French began to do. It all started earlier than that in the spring of 1780, when about 7,000 French soldiers arrived with their commanding general, the Comte de Rochambeau, in Newport, Rhode Island. After a storm blew the British Navy out of the region, the French army was free to begin preparations with Washington and his continental forces. The French fleet in New England, commanded by the Comte de Barras, was ordered to harass British shipping in Newfoundland, and the French forces in Newport joined with Washington's men outside of Newport, New York City, in White Plains. And remember that, the Comte de Barras was told to go to Newfoundland to harass British shipping. That will become a very interesting note later in the episode. But there's another French fleet. This one was down in the West Indies and was being commanded by the Comte de Grasse. The Comte de Rochambeau, the commanding general of the French forces, had instructed de Grasse to head north when he was finished with his business in the West Indies, so he could support the army there. Interestingly enough, Rochambeau did not totally trust Washington or what he would do with this information if he updated him, so instead he decided to tell Washington that de Grasse might be able to make it, but wasn't totally sure. During this time, in March of 1781, a third French fleet was on its way to the Americas, a trip that was wholly unopposed by the British because they were too busy occupying themselves with trying to take Gibraltar. Because remember, at this point, the Spanish were fully involved in the war. These fleets and the Britain's casual response to their movements will prove to be a deciding factor in this campaign, as they will eventually trap Cornwallis and the British on land, forcing them into their ultimate surrender. And these logistics that I just spoke about, I'm laying the groundwork for you, and we'll dive into a bit more detail on how this Allied plan eventually played out. Meanwhile, while Rochambeau and Washington were trying to figure out what their next move was going to be, Cornwallis was still in the Carolinas, becoming increasingly frustrated. And because of a feud with his British admiral, Marriott Arbuthnot, and neither of them cooperating with each other, not a lot of progress was being made. After a British army in Portsmouth, Virginia, right outside of present-day Norfolk, was ordered south to assist Cornwallis, the one and only Benedict Arnold was sent to Virginia to replace them. Arnold arrived in the Chesapeake Bay on December 20th, 1780, and proceeded to raid Richmond, Virginia, and travel around the region, fortifying Portsmouth and gaining control of the local areas. Washington, hearing of Arnold's arrival, decided to send his own expedition down there in response, and he put the Marquis de Lafayette in command. Lafayette traveled south with about 1,200 men and reached the northern tip of the Chesapeake, waiting for his transport. While waiting for transport, he decided he personally was going to head down to Yorktown and these areas around the Virginia shore himself to check out what was going on. As the Marquis was assessing the situation, Washington finally convinced a French fleet, to head south with about 10 ships. Once Clinton received word of this, he sent Admiral Arbuthnot south with a fleet and General Williams with about 2,000 men to join Arnold. The British fleet beat back the French and took control of the Chesapeake, while the British militia and land forces, now led by Phillips, overwhelmed the Virginia militia. The only saving grace in all of this was that the Marquis de Lafayette was able to reach Richmond and fortify the defenses before Phillips and his men were able to raid it once again, like Arnold had done. It was at this point that Cornwallis, now with an army only numbering about 1,400 men, decided to write a letter to Clinton asking for instructions. Except he didn't really ask for instructions. Instead, he told Clinton what should be done. He wanted to head north to the Chesapeake, establish a base there, and then attack the colony from the central point. Keep in mind, this trip north was a direct violation of previous orders from Clinton, but Cornwallis knew all the real action was happening on the Virginia coast, and he wanted in. He wanted to consolidate his remaining army with the forces under Phillips and Arnold, and with the protection of Arbuthnot's fleet. It made sense on paper. So that's exactly what Cornwallis did. As he arrived in Petersburg, his ranks had swelled to about 7,000 men, and no real desire to meet him in open field battle. Lafayette was determined to stay in Richmond until he received further instructions from Washington. Phillips died from fever, and Cornwallis wanted Arnold the hell out of there, so he sent him back to New York. I mean, seriously, no one likes this guy. And Cornwallis took total control of operations. Prior to his arrival, Clinton had sent Phillips instructions to establish a fortified base and raid economic targets in Virginia. Cornwallis, though, wanted to first focus on Lafayette and von Steuben, who was heading up the Virginia militia. Not being able to handle Cornwallis, both retreated rapidly, causing Cornwallis to sic Banastre Tarleton on them. While his forces were weakened significantly from his embarrassing defeat at the hands of Daniel Morgan at the Battle of Cowpens, Tarleton was still not someone to be trifled with. And here's one of the challenges that Cornwallis really faced. Because when he arrived in Virginia, he didn't have much of a grand plan. And Lafayette knew he was not going to be able to meet him in battle, so he took a page out of Greene's book, and it was actually really effective. Lafayette is seen by many in the Revolutionary War as like a French teenage boy who epitomized the thirst for freedom and in turn became like the surrogate son of Washington. But his ability to maneuver in Virginia and avoid a frontal attack by Tarleton and Cornwallis, build up an army, and survive these challenges while harassing them at the same time until help arrived, shouldn't be undersold. He clearly had matured as an officer, and Washington was correct to trust him with such a large responsibility in Virginia. But Tarleton still wanted blood, and he made haste for Charlottesville, capturing a few Virginia legislature, and then put his eyes on Monticello, the house of Thomas Jefferson. Tarleton was probably drooling at the idea of catching Jefferson. Remember, this is the guy who captured Charles Lee in his underwear, more or less. Can you imagine if he was also able to capture the author of the Declaration of Independence in his own home? Fortunately for Jefferson, he was able to escape just prior to Tarleton's arrival by like 15 minutes. So as a consolation prize, a small consolation prize, Tarleton and his men were able to drink all of Jefferson's wine. That'll show him. In June, Lafayette found some reprieve, being reinforced with militia from Pennsylvania and another 1,000 men under William Campbell. At this point, Lafayette's forces had grown to about 4,500 men, and he was feeling a bit more confident. But Cornwallis was undeterred and not intimidated, not even seemingly bothered by Lafayette. And he slowly began to continue to take more land in Virginia, creeping toward the coast, looking for a spot to fortify. While Lafayette was trying to build up a force in Virginia, Washington and Rochambeau were considering what their potential options were. On May 21st, 1780, in Wethersfield, Connecticut, Washington met with Rochambeau. And this is where that distrust I alluded to at the beginning of the episode seemed to change the course of history. Rochambeau and Washington got along fine, but Rochambeau fancied himself a more competent officer than George Washington. And on top of this, Washington had actually written a letter earlier in the war complaining about Rochambeau that was then intercepted by the British and published for all to see. Pretty embarrassing. So at this point in their conversations, remember that there are two French fleets, There's one in the West Indies, and there's one off of the coast of Rhode Island. And there's one French army, led by Rochambeau. Rochambeau and Washington agreed to move his army from Newport to join up with the Continental forces at White Plains. So, step one, army moved from Rhode Island to New York. Check. Okay. But meanwhile, there were still two more fleets. The Comte de Barras had his fleet off the coast of Rhode Island, and remember, that had been previously instructed to travel up to Newfoundland to harass the British. And then Comte de Grasse had his forces in the West Indies. Washington wanted de Grasse to come up from the Caribbean to New York to support him there, potentially for an attack on Clinton. The attack Clinton had been more or less waiting for the last 3 years. Rochambeau argued with Washington, reasoning with him that action in Virginia would be far more beneficial, seeing as the British were much weaker in Virginia than they were in New York. So Washington sent a letter to de Grasse, basically outlining both options, but, listing his trip to New York as the first option. It was seemingly objective, but if you read it, you likely knew what Washington wanted him to do. But Rochambeau wasn't having it. He was not going to put his army at risk. He wanted to end the war, and he knew it should be fought in Virginia, whether this American general believed him or not. In a private letter, Rochambeau wrote to de Grasse and said he wanted the fleet to travel north to Virginia, not New York. Additionally, Rochambeau then used some backline communications to reach out to de Barras and convinced him not to go up to Newfoundland, but instead keep the fleet close in case they needed it in the future. So by July of 1781, the French army joined the Continentals in White Plains. De Barras was holding close to the shore in case he was needed, and they waited patiently to hear the response from de Grasse in the West Indies. De Grasse, receiving word of the plans, prepared to sail north. He negotiated with the Spanish to protect the gains he had made in the West Indies, and he set sail with his entire fleet, 28 ships and 3,500 troops under the command of the Marquis de Saint-Simon. So this lays it out. The British, technically, are in control of Virginia for now, Cornwallis controlling the army and the small British fleet outside of the area. But the Americans and the French are beginning to mobilize. With the movement of the French army to New York, Clinton began to freak out a little bit. I mean, was it finally happening? Were Washington and the French finally going to attack him in New York? Adding fuel to that fire were the letters that Clinton intercepted, written by Washington to Lafayette, that suggested an attack on New York was forthcoming. And the reason it suggested that is because, well, in Washington's mind, an attack on New York was forthcoming. At this point, Clinton became reactionary, sending confusing and sometimes contradictory orders down to Cornwallis. Stay in Virginia. No, come up to New York. No, go to Pennsylvania. Okay, yes, stay in Virginia. In the end, Clinton instructed Cornwallis to, yes, stay in Virginia, fortify either Yorktown or Williamsburg. Eventually, after checking out some other locations also, Cornwallis decided that he was in fact going to fortify Yorktown. Clinton had recently sent him some updated plans, informing him that Yorktown was a good choice because of the deepwater port. The Navy wanted out of New York. They couldn't really get up the Hudson River, and it froze in the winter. I mean, the weather is brutal. Cornwallis was weary of this plan because he thought that being stationed in the Chesapeake left you a bit too prone to attack, but he did it anyway. Additionally, since Cornwallis was fortifying this harbor, he was more or less boxing himself in, right? Not allowing he or his men the freedom of movement that they needed. On August 6th, Lafayette learned that Cornwallis was indeed fortifying Yorktown, and he was chomping at the bit to figure out a way to take advantage of this mistake. Admiral Rodney, whom de Grasse had been fighting against in the West Indies, didn't think that de Grasse, when he was heading out, was actually going to take his entire fleet. Therefore, Rodney only took 16 of his 21 ships north after the French. So Rodney sent Sir Samuel Hood north with the fleet, and he was more than happy with 16 ships, stating that his fleet was, quote, equal fully to defeat any designs of the enemy, let de Grasse bring or send what number of ships he might in aid of Barras. So, Samuel Hood, blissfully unaware that de Grasse had taken his entire fleet north, set sail on August 10th, 5 days after de Grasse. On August 14th, when Washington learned of de Grasse's decision to sail for the Chesapeake, not New York, and still not realizing that Rochambeau told him to sail for the Chesapeake and not New York, Washington begrudgingly gave up his grand plans for attacking New York and decided to take the combined French and American force south toward the Chesapeake to meet up with Lafayette and von Steuben. While Washington seemed to have been fixated on the idea that the war would have been decided in New York, for the past 5 years he was convinced of this. Once he heard Cornwallis had holed up in Yorktown, he excitedly made the move. See, Virginia was Washington's territory. He knew the land well, and he knew that Yorktown was a very vulnerable spot to fortify, and that once you're there, you could easily be surrounded and then out of options. Rochambeau's sneaky plan worked out after all. So as Washington packed up his bags and decided to head south, he also decided to take advantage of his previous obsession with New York and engaged in several misdirection tactics to make Clinton think that the attack on New York was still imminent, even sending men to march along New Jersey and to make camp across the river from Staten Island, as they would have if they were preparing an attack on New York. Remember, Clinton had intercepted that letter from Washington to Lafayette in the spring that detailed his plan to attack New York, and no, this was not a trick. At that point in time, remember, Washington did plan on attacking, so this is sort of an example of when things begin to fall into place, I guess. As Hood was heading up toward the Chesapeake, he saw that at this point no French had arrived. The mouth of the Chesapeake Bay was empty, and he decided to continue north to New York to meet up with Admiral Graves, who had taken over for Arbuthnot. This left the area wide open to the French. Things were working out perfectly for the Americans. The combined Franco-American force led by Washington and Rochambeau traveled over 450 miles to Virginia in 3 weeks, a logistical miracle pulled off by Washington. The Franco-American force had a head start south, and it was a good one. They needed to keep pressing as quickly as they could so they could try to get to Yorktown before Cornwallis had a chance to escape or before Clinton got wise and sent reinforcements. But here's the problem. It wasn't all about just Clinton figuring out what was going on. Clinton had no ability to send reinforcements. His men could not march south quick enough, and he had no fleet to sail them south with. So, the Franco-American forces had things working out for them. Washington and Rochambeau were marching south. De Grasse was marching north from the West Indies. And de Barras was starting to sail his fleet south. De Barras made sure to travel far from the East Coast so as not to be detected by the Royal Navy, while de Grasse was heading right towards Virginia. And he arrived at the Chesapeake, de Grasse that is, unmolested, unloaded troops, and helped Lafayette blockade Cornwallis on land while he blockaded the James and the York rivers on water. While de Grasse was unloading men in Virginia, Hood, Clinton, and Graves were meeting in New York planning a potential attack on the French fleet in New England. Except one big problem. De Barras is no longer in the New England area. He was on his way south. Once they realized this, along with the news that Washington was also headed south, they immediately took action. Graves sailed for the Chesapeake with 19 ships of the line in a desperate attempt to block the French. Meanwhile, Clinton wrote to Cornwallis warning him that Washington was on his way toward him and promising to send him at least 4,000 troops his way for reinforcements. On September 5th, the British fleet arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and the two navies had it out. De Grasse with 24 ships of the line up against Graves' 19. And this is what is known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. This is a critical battle in the war because if the French don't win this battle, then they're not able to provide naval support against Washington, Rochambeau, and Lafayette's land forces. The British needed a smashing victory because the French already controlled the mouth of the Chesapeake, whereas the French only needed to not lose the battle. After a couple hours of maneuvering, the ships found themselves incredibly close to each other, unloading cannon fire for about 2 hours. When the smoke cleared, it was clear that the French had won a narrow tactical victory, driving off the British fleet and forcing them to the southeast in order to make a lane available for de Barras, who was heading south from Rhode Island. Graves, realizing he did not have enough ships left that were in fighting shape, made north to New York for repairs, leaving Cornwallis all by himself to defend his army against enemy on both land and the sea. Some considered to continue to fight the French and maybe even try to break into the Chesapeake and bail out Cornwallis, but at this point they would be risking having their ships get trapped and captured, something that would have had an enormous impact on the wider global war that was being fought around the world. The Second French Fleet arrived and transported the Franco-American army down the Chesapeake to Yorktown, and then anchored themselves behind Yorktown to complete the encirclement of Cornwallis's army. Rochambeau, de Grasse, and de Barras all converged on Cornwallis. Cornwallis at this time was likely seriously considering cutting bait and bailing on this whole Yorktown thing, but on September 14th, he received a letter from Clinton telling him that 4,000 reinforcements were on their way. This was likely instrumental in keeping Cornwallis in Yorktown. The reason this is so important is because it was at this time that the only army keeping Cornwallis at Yorktown was Lafayette's forces. Tarleton was pleading with Cornwallis to force their way out of this sticky situation they were in, but Cornwallis decided to be patient and stay where they were. Realizing too late the potentially disastrous mistake that Cornwallis made, he wrote to Clinton on September 17th that, quote, "I am of the opinion that you can do me no effectual service but by coming directly to this place. If you cannot relieve me very soon, you must prepare to hear the worst." The same day that Cornwallis wrote this final plea to Clinton, Washington arrived outside of Yorktown to assess the situation. Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse began to formalize their plans for the siege. De Grasse was convinced to wait until late October to leave. It was originally going to be mid-October. For whatever reason, he really wanted to get back to the West Indies to protect the land he had captured up to this point in the war. I mean, he had worked really hard for that stuff and didn't want to just give it up. But upon hearing rumors of another British fleet arriving in New York to head south, de Grasse once again was ready to abandon his plans. And he said, well, forget the end of October, forget mid-October, I want to head out now. It actually took a personal plea from the Marquis de Lafayette to keep him in the Chesapeake and support the siege, and that he did. And fortunately for him, he didn't even need to stay till the end of October to do it. So de Grasse decided to stay and provided 2,000 Marines and some cannons for the siege. And what a scene. You have the Marquis de Lafayette, Baron von Steuben, George Washington, Henry Knox, Benjamin Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, and Rochambeau all at the Battle of Yorktown. The only real American Revolution celebrities that aren't here are Nathaniel Greene, who's still fighting the war in South Carolina, and Daniel Morgan, who at this point had retired. The geography of Yorktown is an interesting one, and I'd like to take just a second and describe it to you. And of course, I'll have maps up on Facebook and Twitter of this when the episode is posted. When you enter the Chesapeake Bay, south of the Delmarva Peninsula, and today it's actually nicknamed the Delmarva Peninsula because the peninsula is part Delaware, part Maryland, and part Virginia. So if you enter the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, south of Delmarva, and you turn due north, you'd be going up the bay and into Maryland and eventually run into the port city of Baltimore. If you continue to travel west, you'll see two rivers, the York and the James River. A peninsula juts out into the bay, separating these two rivers. The river to the north is the York River, where Yorktown is located, and the river to the south is the James River, where, yeah, you guessed it, Jamestown is located. It was on the southern coast of the York River, the northern river, that we see Yorktown. Right on the other side of this small town of Yorktown on a plateau right up against the river is Gloucester Point. And that will come into play in just a few more minutes. On September 28th, 1781, the siege of Yorktown was formally underway, with the combined Franco-American forces of about 16,000 men. Oh, and did I mention the French fleet had like another 15,000? So yeah, Cornwallis knew he was totally screwed. He had maybe 8,000. But he and his men were not going to go down easy, firing immense cannon fire early in the siege, but once the Franco-American army began to return cannon fire, the British shortly relented. Over time, the Franco-American forces began to build trenches and move themselves closer to town. They built 2 parallel trenches, slowly pushing forward, the second one being only a couple hundred yards from Yorktown. They built the second parallel trench by October 11th, and by the night of October 14th, the French and the Americans rained down artillery fire almost unopposed. Cornwallis had drawn all of his men into the city and hunkered himself down as he likely was waiting for reinforcements from Clinton, not really knowing what to do next. On October 16th, Cornwallis made one last attempt to salvage something by sending some of his men across the York River to that piece of land, Gloucester Point, where Tarleton was. But to no avail. The weather was too bad, and he did not have enough ships to make it happen. About 2.5 weeks after the siege had begun, Cornwallis realized there was no hope. On October 17th, he opened up formal negotiations to surrender, writing to George Washington, quote, "I propose a cessation of hostilities to settle terms of surrender of the post of York and Gloucester." That same day, the British fleet had finally decided to head south with 6,000 reinforcements, but hearing of the size of the combined French fleets and the surrender of Cornwallis, they decided to turn around and not really participate in this one. One French naval officer noted that the British fleet, quote, "were too late. The fowl had been eaten." But not so fast. This negotiation for surrender was not going to run as smoothly as you may think. Remember earlier in the war when Benjamin Lincoln trapped himself at Charleston, just as Cornwallis did here at Yorktown? Happened about 1.5 years ago. Well, as we mentioned in episode 67, Lincoln asked for full military honors in surrender so they could, hold their guns and wave their flags like respecting gentlemanly soldiers. And Clinton and Cornwallis more or less laughed at him. Well, what goes around comes around. Washington told Cornwallis's men that they would be treated the same way the American army had been treated at Charleston. No full military honors. After negotiating another few small points, on October 19th, the British garrison came out for their surrender. The French were lined up looking all pristine and nice, and on the other side, the American ragged army was probably standing there looking, well, not. Rumors have it that while marching to the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," the French came out for surrender. Cornwallis, though, was conveniently ill, unable to make the procession of surrender, and he did not attend the ceremony. Instead, he sent out his deputy, General O'Hara, to deliver his sword, and O'Hara at first tried to hand it to the French officer. I mean, the whole time, the British were looking at the French. They were ignoring the fact that the Americans were even there. Oh, the vanity is strong with these men. Instead, O'Hara was directed to hand it to George Washington, who then said, Cornwallis too ill to come out and surrender himself? Yeah, I'm not accepting his sword. You can give it to my boy over here, Benjamin Lincoln. The American commander that you forced to capitulate without military honors at Charleston. How sweet it is. On October 20th, Cornwallis informed Clinton of the shocking turn of events, writing him, quote, "Sir, I have the mortification to inform your excellency that I have been forced to give up the post of York and Gloucester and to surrender the troops under my command by capitulation on the 19th instant as prisoners of war to the combined forces of America and France." The British troops were taken as prisoners of war and marched toward Virginia and Maryland. Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold were both sent back to England in December. Man, what a pleasant boat ride that must have been. Everyone else seemed to go their separate ways. De Grasse and de Barras sailed to the West Indies. Rochambeau took his army to Rhode Island. Greene continued to fight the good fight in North Carolina, and Washington returned to New York. When news reached Congress and the colonies, people were partying like it was 1776 all over again, ringing bells, having parties, and I'm sure drinking quite a bit of booze. Congress was so jacked up that they actually debated whether or not they should have Washington arrest Cornwallis and hang him publicly. Eventually, this was voted down. I mean, thank God. Could you imagine if they had actually done that? Now, the war wasn't officially over. Britain could have sent over more ships and more men, and that was an idea that King George III was on board with, but everyone who really knew the challenges Britain now faced knew it was all over. On November 25th, Lord North received the news and did not respond well. Lord Germain described his reaction to the news as, quote, "He would have taken a ball on his breast, for he opened his arms, exclaiming wildly as he paced up and down the apartment during the few minutes, 'Oh God, it is all over.'" King George, while responding very maturely initially, soon fell into a depression over the turn of events and even considered abdicating his throne in the shadow of this failure. Germain was dismissed in early 1782, with Lord North to follow shortly after. Cornwallis wasn't treated too harshly, but Clinton was, spending seemingly the rest of his life defending his actions and his own reputation, only to be laughed at by the rebels, despised by the British, and cursed by the Loyalists, as historian Harold Larrabee puts so nicely. In the years that followed, Clinton and Cornwallis publicly feuded back and forth on who was most responsible for the defeat. Real mature guys. In the end, the 1781 campaign by de Grasse was masterful. Lafayette did a great job in containing Cornwallis, Washington made the correct decision to move south quickly, and Rochambeau likely made the proper call by privately telling de Grasse to head to the Chesapeake instead of New York. Admiral Barras violated his original orders to head to Newfoundland, making him available to support the troops at Yorktown. The Spanish did de Grasse a solid by not releasing his troops and ships to him, but also agreeing to protect his holdings in the south while he traveled north. And lastly, de Grasse eventually begrudgingly agreed to overstay his original plans in Chesapeake, remaining just long enough to see the campaign through to the end. Everything seemed to fall in place. And now, finally, everything is looking pretty good for the Americans. Next week, we will wrap up this war and begin to dive into the details of the negotiations with the British that led to establishing, once and for all, finally, by episode 70, we have ourselves the United States of America. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.